Enterprise in Arizona. Hope you're having a super fantastic sparkling day. Welcome to Before the Dirt Nap podcast, number 1965. Terrific Clues Day, solving the mystery of female ancestors. So I was reading an article today about how you go about finding information on your female ancestors. And some of them can be a little tricky because when women got married, their last names changed. So I thought it would be good to have a look at this to see how do you figure out who is the mother of somebody when you don't know what their maiden name was. And it was called a maiden name because they were a maid and it was their name. So they were a maiden name. Anyway, so there are some interesting ways that you can go about finding women and their maiden names and things like that. And I use what we're talking about today is I use these techniques a lot when I'm looking for a female ancestor. So these are very good ways to help you overcome that. And my question for you today is, what creative strategies have you used to uncover the maiden name of a female ancestor in your family tree? So all of the ones that we're going to talk about today are techniques that I use. So first off, we've got the importance of finding maiden names. Why discovering a female's maiden name can unlock new family connections, because you're basically blocking off an entire branch of your tree. If you've got the husband here, you've got the wife here. The husband's tree goes on like this because his surname never changes. His last name never changes. His wife's name does change when she gets married. Now, I'm talking about everything from I totally should have looked this up beforehand. But up until recently, when recently I'm talking about probably around the 1950s, 60s, 70s, sometime in then, most women, when they got married, changed their name up until that point. And then there was this whole women's movement thing, and they decided we're going to keep our name, we're not going to change it, and that's when things started. And I think that was around the 60s or the 70s that started. Not 100% sure, and I should have looked it up beforehand, but I am going to look it up later. So one of the important reasons of finding the maiden name is because until you find that maiden name, you've lost an entire branch of your family tree. And if you think about this, you've got your parents, so father and mother. And if you don't have your mother's maiden name, you're missing that entire section. The only place you can research is your father's side because his doesn't change. But every time you get to a woman, if you don't have her maiden name, you're locking out other important details to your family connections. And that female line could lead you to being related to somebody who's famous. It could lead you to somebody in your family tree who had did something of historical significance. So there's all sorts of things as to why you want to go and find their maiden names. Now, marriage records. I tell you, when it comes to birth, death, and marriage records, I absolutely love them because there's so much information you can get from them. So marriage records, you can use civil records, church records, alternative sources to locate records of marriages where their maiden name is often recorded. Because when they get married, on a marriage certificate, it will have the groom's names, his given names, and he could have a first name and might have one or two middle names, maybe even three middle names. I've got a second great-grandfather who's got three middle names, or three first names. Middle name and first name and two middle names. And then there's their last name. Underneath them is the bride, and it will have her full name, so her first name and middle name if there is one. Sometimes they may leave them off the marriage records, but I'll tell you where to find them later on. And then her maiden name. And then on the marriage record, you may also find that their occupation, what is their occupation, their age, and some of them may say of age, which means that whatever age they are legally able to get married without parental consent. Now, this is interesting because for the men back in the 1800s through to early 1900s, they had to be 21 years of age to not require parental consent to get married. That was for the men. The women had to be of age 18 to not require parental consent. So obviously they figured out the men needed, for some reason, they had to go until the age of 21 before they were able to legally make that decision that they wanted to get married, and they did not require their parental consent. I thought that was always funny. But then they say women mature faster than men do, so maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know. And then also on there too will be the father's names and their occupations. So you'll have the groom's father's name, you'll have the bride's father's name and their occupations. Now you have more clues to that mother's side of the tree. Looking on children's records, birth or baptismal certificates of children often list the mother's maiden name. That's another place that you can look. So when you find the records for their children, there's another clue in there. Death certificates can often provide the maiden name, especially if the informant was knowledgeable about the deceased. Now, as we've talked in past videos, when you are looking up the death certificate, you have to remember that the person giving the information may not be related to that family. It could be a next door neighbor. It could be a friend of the family. So there could be a little bit of information that could be missing in there. And I remember when I had to give all Brad's information for his death certificate, they wanted his father's name. They wanted his mother's name, including her maiden name. And they wanted to know if they were still alive, if they had deceased, if they were no longer with us, when did they die, when did they pass away. And then there was all of Brad's information that had to go in there of where and when he was born. They already had, of course, all the death certificate, the death information there, but I had to fill in all the blanks. Did he have any children that were still living, and what were the ages of those children? And you just had to put M and whatever. If it was male, you put M for male. If it was a female, you'd put F, and then you put the ages, and you had to list them in order. So there was that information that went on there as well. There's a lot of information that's required. So when you're looking at a death certificate, always look down on the bottom to see who was the informant, because it always asks how were they related to the person who had passed. Were they a friend? Were they a cousin? Were they an aunt, an uncle, a parent, a spouse? Who was it that gave that information? And that way you can determine how reliable some of the father-mother information can be. So always check for that information as well. So death certificates, you often ask for the woman's maiden name. And if the informant is knowledgeable about that, it will be there. Cemetery records and headstones sometimes include the maiden name or a clue to her family of origin. If you go to a cemetery, most times you can go into the office there at the cemetery and ask for a plot record. The plot record and the headstone may say, this is who's in the grave, this is their birth information, their death information, and it'll look like a normal gravestone with information on there. But the plot record will show even more information. A lot of plot records will say who purchased that plot and when, and every time that plot was opened and why it was opened. Was it opened, originally to put this person's body in there, and here is their birth and death information, here is their full name. Then we had to open it again a few years later because we had to put this person's ashes in there, and it will tell you whether it was a coffin or ashes. Was it a burial, or was it interring ashes? The names of all the people that are in that plot. And there have been times when we were in New Zealand and my mum and I would go to cemetery records that we would find surprises in the plot. Surprises being that the headstone did not give a list of everybody who was buried in that plot. And it could be, ashes were interred. The family didn't know what to do with. Oh, let's just open this plot and stick them in there. Basically is how they did it. But it had on the plot record every time that grave was opened and why and who was put in there. Was it a body or was it ashes? So plot records can be very revealing. And in fact, on one of them, I think it was a second great grandmother. There was her daughter got married to this guy that my second great grandmother could not stand. Totally hated him. Did not think he was right for her daughter. Blah 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 blah. All of this animosity and everything else. Guess who's buried in that grave with her? She bought the plot, and we have the date when she bought the plot. We had the date when she was interred in there, and who else is in there? Her son-in-law that she doesn't like. So now they are resting together for eternity, in the same plot. So you can find very interesting records in there of who else is buried in there. And sometimes you'll come across a name and you're like, who the heck is that? And you have to go and research it. And it could be a daughter that you didn't know about who is buried there under her married name. So you've then got to go and find out, well, who is this person? So plot records are very interesting and can be very revealing about who's in there and who's not. And on the tombstone, it may have a person's name on there, but they're not actually buried in the plot, because it could be that they passed away overseas, like during World War I, World War II, something like that, and they're buried in some cemetery over in whatever country they were fighting in at the time, in one of those memorial cemetery things that they have for those that died, for the military that died during the war, but they put them on the tombstone. They've listed them on the tombstone, so they have somewhere close by that they can come and remember that person, and so that person is not forgotten. And so people have somewhere to come within their own country. And so I think that's a beautiful tribute. It's a tribute to them, even though their body is actually buried somewhere overseas in some military, some war grave somewhere. So it just gives those who are part of the family somewhere to come to honor that person, which I think is really cool. So yes, obituaries. These often mention surviving relatives, including the maiden name of the spouse's wife or names of her siblings. And if you've got that, that Sue Jones has passed away, and then you're reading that she is survived by her brother, William Smith. Now you know her maiden name was Smith. So a person might have been a half sibling where they share a mother, but the father was different. So be very careful with that. Sometimes it will reveal her maiden name. Sometimes it may not when it comes to the siblings, especially if you see siblings with the male siblings with different names. You know that one of them, they may have the same mother, but they could have different fathers. So be careful with that one. Unless it mentions who, and some obituaries get very detailed, which I absolutely love those ones. They tell this whole story. They give the whole family tree. They go, this is the person who passed away. They were the child of, and it's got the father's name and the mother's maiden name right there. And that might have like DEC after their name in parentheses, which means that they are deceased. And then they have survived by, and they might have the spouse's name there. They may have all their children listed. Now, typically on obituaries, they will list the children in birth order. And if you have like a name like Susie, and in parentheses it says Joseph, her husband's name is Joseph, and it may have after the parentheses what her married name is. So look for clues obituaries are full of information. Absolutely love it. And then I just go and verify all that information and before I put it into the trees and all that sort of, I'll put it in the trees and then I don't know why my thumbs are up. We'll just go 2 thumbs up then, because that one has a better effect when there's 2 thumbs up. Now it's not gonna, there we go. I like that one better. Anyway, total sidetrack. So obituaries can be full of really good information. And then it goes and lists the grandchildren in the order of birth again. And it may even put the parents' names there with their children, and then it might have them on this line. Then on the next line, it's got the next child with their children, and down the thing. So there's no real format to obituaries, but the ones that have the most detail in, I absolutely love those ones. Land records and deeds. Women were sometimes included in a land transaction, particularly if they inherited property through their family. So yes, so sometimes you can find that on land records and deeds. Church records, baptisms, confirmations, membership rolls can sometimes include the woman's maiden name, especially if they were baptized there. And when in baptisms, it will list who the parents are, which I absolutely love when it happens. And it puts the mother's maiden name on the baptismal records. DNA testing, using tools like DNA matches to triangulate maiden names and identify her family line comes in handy every time. It could be that you find somebody who is connected to that person. Like I have found people on my mother's side of the family that could be 3rd or 4th cousins, and we all lead back to the same person. And fortunately, I already know what her maiden name was anyway. But if it was a maiden name that was unknown, like, oh yeah, when working with, and then you collaborate with that person and you figure it out and you work it back to see how you are related. Because remember, DNA shows that you are related by blood. Genealogy shows you how you are related. And that's always the big question, because people see these little centimorgans after the numbers, and people go, oh, well, if it's this many centimorgans, it means that you could be this, or this. And I'm like, people, it just shows that you're blood related. That's it, period. You're blood related. Yes, the centimorgans may track to that, but I have had times where, like my aunt, she was on there, and based on the centimorgans, Ancestry was telling me that was my cousin. I'm like, no, that is my aunt. Yeah, so please, if you see the centimorgans there, don't go, oh, but this means that I could be da-da-da-da. No, contact the person, reach out to the person, have a conversation with them. If they've got their tree online, have a look at their tree. If it's public and available, have a look at that to see if you can see where the connection is. Sometimes on Ancestry, it will show you what the common relative is. maybe, what the common relative may be. So that gives you, I use Sina Morgan's method to go, okay, how many levels am I going to be going? How many levels from me to our common grandparent down to them? Because that's going to give you a lot of detail on that. But joining forces with somebody else who has a DNA match with you to try and find that, to try and triangulate everything else, they may know who your third great grandmother's what your third great grandmother's maiden name was, and that's the one that you're trying to find out. So collaborate with DNA matches, and just talk with them and have a general conversation with them and chit chat backwards and forwards and things. You never know. Where are we up to? Community and social histories. Look for clues in local histories that might mention your ancestor in the context of her maiden family. And this could be, finding out more about that person. You might find them in school records. You might do some more research on that. Who did they get married to? If they have an uncommon last name, it's going to be a lot easier to find records about them if the records exist online, because they may exist just offline and you might have to go in person or have somebody go in person to have a look at those records. And you may or may not be able to copy those records based on the copyright of the material. Yes, there's all sorts of things you're going to come in. All that legal stuff that's in there. There could be a naming pattern. Let's see if I can remember how this was done. Okay, so sometimes in a naming pattern, the woman's maiden name was sometimes passed on as a middle name for children or grandchildren, or even as a first name. So you could have, you've got a guy called Langford. You come across Langford in the tree and you're like, where did Langford come from? It could be his mother's maiden name. It could be his maternal grandmother's maiden name. They're just using a way to carry that name on and honor that particular person. It could be that that family had all girls and this was a way of keeping their name alive. Oftentimes, there was a naming thing, and I've got to try and remember this. In England, for a while, there was a naming pattern. And like the middle name of the first son was, no, I'm not even going to go there because I honestly can't remember. But I know that the mother's maiden name came into it at some point, often on the daughter's, as the daughter's middle name, sometimes as the son's middle name. So look at first and middle names of children as well, because that could be a clue as to a maiden name. It could be on the paternal side, it could be on the maternal side, but it could be a clue. So it's just something that you just note and keep track of as you're researching. Historical context. Understand the cultural and legal norms of the time that may have influenced the availability of records. So when you're looking at these records and things, what records were available at the time? Were they just kept in the church? Were they, because I know in the States, it wasn't until the early 1900s, around the 1920s, 1930s in some states, where it became required by federal law to record births, deaths, and marriages. Up until that point, it was just kept on parish records. And if they didn't get married in a parish, it wasn't recorded. If they didn't get baptized, their birth wasn't recorded. Yeah, so we do have some ways with that as well. So having a look at the historical context, what was the norm for recording things at that time? Also, the availability of the records. Has there been any major storms or fires or things that could have wars that could have destructed records in that area? So you may not even get to be able to see records of births, deaths, and marriages because of some natural disaster that went through, some fire that went through, some war that was in there where records got destroyed. So if you come across somebody who says, oh, we've got all of our records, we go all the way back to I would question that one. Not saying that they don't, but it would kind of raise a red flag with me, because I know there's times when in some areas where records have been destroyed, not purposely, accidentally, being natural disaster, a fire, war, although war's kind of a little on purpose, I guess. Since they're destroying a town, they're now destroying all the records that were kept in that town. So look at the history of what areas they came from. Was there anything that may have destroyed records along the way, or are the records still intact? Is there another place that those records may have been moved to? Are they not kept in that town anymore? Maybe they're kept at the state archive level. Maybe they're kept at the county level, not in the town that person was actually born in. And also remember too that there were county line changes. There's been county line changes over the years. So they may have been born in this particular town in, Smith County, but that town is no longer in Smith County. It's in, I don't know, Perryville County. Just making up names here. Because they had a county line shift at some point. So you're looking in Perryville when that record didn't exist in Perryville at the time because it wasn't part of Perryville County. It was part of Smith County. And so now you've got to go look at that town name under Smith County. So look at those records as well. When you're looking at records, look at the area. Were there any county line changes that changed where that town was located? Because that might help you find the records easier that way. Also to look to see if the town name is the same as it was when that person was born, because there may, for whatever reason, they may have had a name change in the town since that person was born. You never know. There's all sorts of things that happen for whatever reason, and some of them we just don't know. Some of them are unexplainable. That's just one of those things. And that's what the fun is about. That's what I love about genealogy. It's this big mystery. It's this huge puzzle. It is the ultimate puzzle that will never be completed. You will never complete your entire family tree in this lifetime because there's always people that are being added to it that have been subtracted from it because they've passed away. People are dying, people are being born, people are getting married. So there's constantly changing within the family tree. And even if you go back generations and then come down on some of those sidelines to, fifth, sixth, seventh cousins, there's always stuff that's changing. And I know some of the big families. I have a friend who went and sat with, was it Rockefeller? I think it was somebody in the Rockefeller family, and found out that they have a full-time genealogist who is on staff keeping track of every birth, death, and marriage in the entire family tree. They've got the entire family tree. They know where all the active branches are and everything else. And they're keeping an eye on all of those branches to see, is there any births, deaths, or marriages taking place in those? Because they may not be part of the core trunk, but they're part of the sideline branches that may at some point come into effect in some will, claim, or whatever at some point along the way. So they have to keep track of those. And they actually have a full-time genealogist on staff whose their sole responsibility is keeping that tree up to date. And I'm just like, that would be a really cool job to have. And they're responsible for keeping and that genealogist is responsible for keeping the family history as well, and telling the current stories and everything else, and just keeping records up to date with everything that happens within the family. So isn't that that would be a really cool job to have, for such an amazing family. You get to learn so much about that family and how they operate and things like that. And there's all sorts of stuff that's out there about, about some of these big, large families and, the biographies and everything else. And yeah, but keeping track. And I think she said that, I want to say that she said that they had over 1,500 to 1,800 people that they are actively keeping track of on this tree. I'm just like, wow, that's amazing. That's really cool. So yeah, there are big families that have dedicated genealogists that's all they do, is just keep track of everything in that family. So keep the history active, keep the history correct as much as possible. But anyway, so those are some of our terrific Clues Day, solving the mystery of your family ancestors. And what creative strategies have you used to uncover a maiden name of a female ancestor in your family tree? So most of the stuff that we went through today, is methods that I use constantly to find maiden names. I also browse newspapers where I'm looking for marriage announcements, especially marriage announcements or engagement notices. So I look for the groom's name, and if I find ones for the groom's name, I go to see who has he got that would match up with this person that's in their tree. Because on the birth record, for some reason of their children, the mother's maiden name was not listed. So, maybe I can find a marriage announcement or a birth announcement, or because sometimes in the birth announcements, they will say Mr. and Mrs. John Smith and had a daughter, and it might put down behind Mrs. Nee, whatever the maiden name was. Maybe they're on the birth announcement. So yeah, there's so many resources out there to help us find maiden names. There's actually a really good book, and I couldn't find it on my bookcase, or I would have brought it in here to show you, but it's a book that's about this thick. I'm trying to remember what size it is, but it's a good size book that gives you all the different ways that you can find a maiden name. It is a really cool book, and I can't even remember the name. I should have looked it up beforehand, but I couldn't find it on my bookcase, and I know I have this particular book, and yeah, it's one of those sort of like big textbook ones. So I'm going to have to go see if I can find it, and if I find it, I'll bring it on one of our shows and show it to you, but it's probably still in a box, or maybe it's been moved to a box, because we are starting to pack up books right now. But anyway, that's it from us for today. Let us know some of the creative ways that you use to find maiden names. Oh, and one that wasn't on my list, ask family members. I know I had the DNA collaboration one, but ask other family members who are living if they know what that particular grandmother, great-grandmother, second great-grandmother, what their maiden name was. Do they know what their maiden name was? One of your relatives who is living may have a family Bible that when you open it, there is the information. So look to see what other resources you have close by that is not official records. That could be like a family Bible. It could be somebody in your family that can tell you that information. So use those resources as well. With that, we are out of here. We'll be back tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Pacific. Fingers crossed that Nicole is feeling better and is able to attend tomorrow night. And yeah, we're going to be talking about home remedies. Home remedies. And she's actually we're going to be in her kitchen making well, she'll be in her kitchen. I'll be here. And she's going to be making home remedies. But anyway, with that, we're out of here. Go out, have a super fantastic, sparkling evening, and we'll catch you guys back here tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Pacific.